Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry.
So today's been a big week at ITPro. If you've gone on the website, www.itpro.co.uk, you may have noticed that things look a little different.
Yes, professionaler, snazzier, black and yellower. It looks really nice, actually. I'm really happy with how it looks.
So we've just had a major redesign of the website, which also coincides with a major platform migration, which, as I'm sure many of our listeners will know, is not the easiest thing in the world to pull off.
Indeed. It can be a bit of a challenge, but I think, all things considered, it went relatively smoothly. Yeah.
And huge shout out to the Dennis Publishing development team, as well as all of the back-end engineers and people who have helped make our site look lovely and new again.
So later on in the show, we'll be talking about Labour's flagship policy, their plan to give all households in the UK free gigabit internet. And we will be joined by Keumars Afifi-Sabet, who is one of our staff writers who specialises in public sector. But before we get into that, let's talk about the news.
One of the stories that we talked about 2 weeks ago was the news that Xerox had put in a $30 billion bid to buy HP. That's HP Inc., the laptop and printer manufacturer, as opposed to HPE, who do the servers and storage. But yeah, Xerox had put in a $30 billion acquisition bid for HP, which has now been roundly rejected by HP.
The board said a very resounding thank you next to the $30 billion offer. It's worth reiterating what we said back when we first discussed this, which is that even the bid is a little bit odd on the part of Xerox, in that HP is a much bigger company of the two, like much bigger, 3 times the size by valuation of Xerox. So it was a bit of a cheeky pitch, but what we found out during this process is that there have been discussions kind of over the years about possibly merging. You know, both companies are legacy companies. They do have their problems, but for HP, their laptop business is much stronger than their printer business. So if they were to acquire Xerox or merge with Xerox, then that would plump up that bit of their business. And indeed, speaking of that, this is not a flat no. There's a bit of a comment that put out by HP's board that maybe they might consider something in the future, although not being acquired by Xerox. I think that's out of the question.
No, yeah, I think they've pretty firmly put the kibosh on being acquired by Xerox. On the other hand, there's a not insignificant chance that HP might turn around and buy Xerox.
Yes, so the key point of this news story, which was written by yours truly, says that with substantive engagement from Xerox management and access to diligence information on Xerox, we believe that we can quickly evaluate the merits of potential transaction. We remain ready to engage with you to better understand your business and any value to be created from a combination. They were pretty clear that the initial offer of $30 billion is, in their opinion, a massive undervaluation of HP. And also they were very, very concerned about the fact that it was going to be largely financed by debt and that the combined company may struggle or indeed be overwhelmed by that debt.
I mean, it does take brass ones to turn around to a $30 billion acquisition offer and go, no, higher. But, it's easy to see where they're coming from. HP is in a pretty good position as hardware manufacturers go. They've done a lot of work in the enterprise space in terms of moving or repositioning into things like managed print services, and things like printer security have been big focuses of theirs in recent years. Not to mention the fact that they do very, very good printers. Their printers test very, very well The last one we reviewed on ITPro was the OfficeJet Pro 9014, which got a 4-star review and was very, very good. That's part of HP's Instant Ink subscription plan, which is another kind of example of them diversifying their business in kind of quite interesting and unique ways.
Yeah, well, it's part of everybody's everything as a service. This is Ink as a service, and you can get software as a service, you get platform as a service, you get computer as a service.
Get services as a service.
Services as a service, yes.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of consolidation in the hardware industry. The likes of Dell, the Dell EMC merger was a big one.
Sure was.
And there's fewer and fewer companies in that kind of physical hardware space now.
Indeed, and while HP Inc. was spun up from HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, HPE has been busy spending on effectively other hardware, smaller hardware companies. Nimble is a notable one. Aruba Networks is another notable one. So money is being spent, but like you say, it's market consolidation, which can be good or bad for customers. Consolidate everything in one place, nice, but it means that you get a bit less competition, which is less nice. As for this deal in particular, or lack of deal between HP and Xerox, the door is open, but I don't think we're going to see anybody walking through it for at least a couple of years, if at all.
Our next story is the report that was released into TSB's pretty catastrophic IT meltdown from April last year, which resulted in Chief Executive Paul Pester stepping down and resulted in just huge amounts of financial losses for the company.
Yeah, not to mention reputational loss, because that always comes hand in hand with a problem like this.
So what happened is essentially that TSB had a massive migration project, and during said migration, basically the entire company's services fell over, essentially. They experienced a massive multi-day outage of things like online banking, telephone banking. Branch systems were having problems. It was just a mess, really. Basically, the company's trading ground to a halt.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you get the fact that fraudsters, of course, got in on the act. People lost significant money through that as well. Their customer base, this kind of thing is just an IT and reputational nightmare. So for a little bit more detail, the plan was to migrate 5 million customers onto a state-of-the-art system last year, all in one go. So it was what is known as a big bang migration.
As opposed to a phased rollout where you do little bits at a time.
Yeah. With what happened is that they did decide to go with everything all at the same time. The problem if you do that, obviously, is that if there are problems, the problems affect everything all at the same time. Whereas if you just migrate, say, internet banking, it's not ideal, but at least people can go to their branch and that's still working. Or vice versa. If you can't go in branch, at least you can do some stuff online.
Yeah. It's generally seen to be faster and cheaper to do a big bang migration rather than a phased rollout. But you're basically rolling the dice, and there are significant risks. If anything in the migration goes wrong, then you are caught quite severely on the back foot for any remediation efforts, because you're also having to finish the migration of all of your systems at the same time as fixing the ones that are broken.
Once again, if you are an SMB of some description, it is far from ideal for your business for this to happen. But at the same time, you are unlikely to suffer the same kind of reputational damage that TSB has, because it won't be front page news. It will be a big problem for you, but the whole country isn't going to know about it.
The report that kind of laid out why this happened was an independent report commissioned after the whole thing went down and after Pester stepped down. And it was conducted by law firm Slaughter and May, and it essentially found that TSB hadn't put enough thought into what may have happened when, as it turns out, when the migration went wrong, and also the system TSB chose was reliant on a huge number of partners who were kind of helping to maintain and support the kind of software platform that they were using, which is a huge number of moving parts to keep track of.
Yeah. That said, TSB, or rather TSB's board, is not super happy with the report.
Understandably.
Well, yeah, but they disagree with elements of it. They have highlighted in particular that its own analysis has identified in particular 2 data centres that were built to support the new platform, and a technical error caused them to be at the centre of this disruption, really. The chairman of the board, Richard Meddings, has said that they commissioned the external report. It doesn't quite line up with what they said, but they're really, really sorry and it won't happen again.
They've said that they've put in place a number of changes to their procedures and practices, which, good. But yeah, they've blamed it in large part on two data centres, which they argue were not configured according to the spec that TSB provided.
Yeah, and in some ways, that's fair enough. There's not much you can do about that as a company. Eventually, in any transaction, there's an element of trust. You can't go in and audit to the extent of literally being like, so let us do a full audit of your systems. That's just not going to happen.
But having said that, there is an element, especially in large IT projects, and especially when those IT projects are financial institutions and financial services companies. You really do have to make sure that you do your due diligence on who you're working with and whether or not the companies that you're partnering with are going to be able to support what you need those systems to do. And the question really is, did TSB do enough due diligence on the IT partners that it was going to be relying on?
It's never going to be possible for us really to answer that question.
No.
But like I say, there is an element of trust, but it's hard to say.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll be hearing from Keumars Afifi-Sabet about Labour's ambitious broadband plans and what it could mean for local businesses.
Hello, I'm Ollie Mann, and every Friday on The Week Unwrapped, we cover the stories you might have missed with journalists from theweek.co.uk. It's all the big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. That's The Week Unwrapped with me, Ollie Mann, available now for free from all good podcast apps.
Welcome back, and we are now joined by Keumars Afifi-Sabet, one of the staff writers at ITPro. Hi, Keumars.
Hi, thanks for having me, Jane and Adam. It's great to be on the ITPro Podcast.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Keumars is our resident public sector guru, so we thought it would be a good idea to get him on to chat about one of the most surprising policies from this election.
Yes, this was quite surprising. It's come as a big surprise to many Labour Party supporters as well as detractors, people in the industry, people in telecoms and networking. I think the CBI Director General even described it as a bolt from the blue at their annual conference this week.
For anyone that hasn't been keeping up with the news, this is the announcement that Labour is going to bring free broadband to all UK premises, and they're going to do it by nationalising parts of BT.
Openreach specifically.
Yes. So, Keumars, I wondered if you could take us through some of the details, or, what we know of the details at this point.
Right, of course. And before we go into the nitty-gritty, let's just have a brief recap of what this will involve. It will bring Openreach into public ownership. This will then be fed into an umbrella organisation known as British Broadband. They will then mandate the rollout of full fibre infrastructure across the UK by 2030. This will start with the most remote areas, moving on to smaller communities, and then finally to towns and cities.
Okay, that's pretty interesting, because obviously for a long time there has been discussion about how rural areas have been really suffering from having no broadband. Some people are still on DSL or quite slow broadband.
Try getting a phone signal in many places.
Well, yes, I look forward to being offline myself over Christmas when I go to visit my parents. But, I also know from experience of living in the countryside, and I mean proper countryside, that slow broadband is a problem. It's annoying as a customer. It's annoying as a student or a pupil at school. But if you are looking to start and run a business rurally, it could be a real pain. So it's nice that they're starting there and working backwards to places that already have okay internet, even if it's not super fast, which is what I understand that they're offering or they're planning to offer.
Oh, that's right. It's a very pointedly different to the way that it's rolling out right now. I think the towns and cities are likely under the current plans to get full fibre before, let's say, the middle of the southwest, for example.
So the big question that has been raised about this plan is, how is Labour planning to pay for this? How is Labour planning to pay for not only nationalising Openreach, which is going to have a fairly big cost in and of itself, which we'll come to a bit later on, but also how is Labour going to pay to maintain and operate the network once it is rolled out?
Well, that's a very good point, and I think I'd add to that, how much is Labour willing to pay for this, and how much do they have to pay for this, because we have seen several different figures flying around recently.
So in terms of costs, the initial figure that's been put forward by Labour is 20 billion for fibre rollout. Now, that's kind of nice and vague about what that means. But it does seem to be in line, according to Sky Fact Check and also BBC's fact checkers, more or less in line with what independent people are saying as well. BT's CEO, his estimate is slightly higher.
Just a tad.
He reckons it'll cost 100 billion.
That's a lot of money.
That is a lot of money.
And significantly more than Labour's quoting.
Well,
It is
yeah.
5 times the amount, effectively.
Indeed.
I mean, there's a very good reason why BT has suggested that it will cost £100 billion, and the Conservative Party, incidentally, has also suggested it would cost £83 billion against Labour's figures. I believe they are adding the cost of the initial nationalisation to the £20 billion full fibre rollout figure in order to come up with a substantially higher sum. Of course, Labour hasn't counted the cost of nationalisation in its plans because Labour is treating that as net cost zero, in that you acquire an asset which can then, at a later point, be traded away again.
That's dicey.
Also, let's dig into that a little bit more. When you talk about the costs of nationalisation, what kind of costs are we talking about?
Well, if we're looking at these figures by BT, it would be anywhere in the region of 60 to 80 billion pounds. Of course, it would completely depend on the market at the time this is done, and the actual cost will also be set through Parliament, according to Labour's plans. So it's quite indeterminate at the moment.
There's also the issue of pensions, which I've heard a number of people bring up, in that Labour will, if they do nationalise Openreach, they will need to effectively pay off the shareholders and the pensions of all of BT's pensioners. Is that?
Well, of course, I think it's one of the reasons why a programme or a plan such as this is so difficult to estimate exactly, or precisely rather. There are also the potential legal costs if BT decides to sue for any reason, which at the moment you can't factor or estimate because you have absolutely no idea how long those proceedings might go on for.
This isn't the only ambitious full fibre plan that has been put forward by a political party. Of course, the government, or indeed the last government, because we are in an election period, promised full fibre by 2025, and as Nicholas Fern covered in his feature for us in October, that fell flat.
And
so
was criticised at the time as well for being wildly unambitious, or wildly conservative, I should say, in its projections for how much it was going to cost.
Yes, I mean that when it comes to the ambition or otherwise, I think the timescale was initially longer. May was 2033, while Boris was going for Tory leadership. He said that's unambitious, made it 2025. Yeah. And then was like, did I mean 2025 or never?
So the big question is, if this plan comes to fruition, what does this mean for businesses?
Right, so the way I see this, there are two levels of effect I think it could have. The first is through the narrow prism of the telecoms market, and the second is the wider UK economy. I should also add, I think part of the plans involve building a business 5G platform, although this is really ill-defined, and we probably won't see any detail around this until at least a second term of a Labour government, given that the plan isn't to get the full fibre rollout finished until 2030. As for the effect on the wider UK economy, Openreach actually commissioned research fairly recently, I'd say, which found it would lead to a £59 billion productivity boost if the plans were to be completed by 2025. Of course, this is under the prism of Boris Johnson's touted proposals back when he was running for Tory leadership. This would then rise to £70 billion by 2038 as a boost to the UK economy. Slower rollouts would defer but not reduce these benefits, so we'd see the same productivity boosts but not for some years after.
The other big question here is, 2030 is 10 years from now, which is one of those things, it feels like a long time. It's actually quite a short amount of time. For example, in the past 7 years, we have invented or had rollout 4G and 5G. So the concern that I have seen mooted as well is that by the time the full fibre rollout is done, this technology will be obsolete.
That's a very good point. There could well be another technology in 2030 or so. I suppose the best way to look at that would be, let's look at these plans against the existing plans for rollout. I suppose currently I don't think there is a date set for full fibre rollout, so we could be seeing full fibre still being rolled out within the next 20 or 30 years.
I can't imagine that we will still be there. I mean, during my lifetime, and I'm sure the lifetime of many of our listeners, I've gone from no internet to dial-up to broadband, to full broadband, to fibre, and now we're moving on towards gigabit internet, which, is fast.
I mean, on the other hand, you should never underestimate the staying power of what some would consider obsolete technologies. There are still, for example, a huge amount of fax machines that are still in active use in businesses and public sector organisations around the world.
We can talk about numbers and costs and feasibility, but I suppose in terms of the rollout of full fibre across the UK, I think I want to make 2 points. First of all, there's quite a massive, significant lag between the UK and the rest of the world. I mean, would it surprise you to hear that Latvia has 90% full fibre infrastructure? Portugal, Sweden and Spain have 70%, and of course South Korea has more than 95% coverage. And we, as the UK, have 8%.
8%?
8.
I am extremely surprised by the figure in Spain, because when I lived there, the apartment that I lived in had no internet at all. And I was like, what do you mean no internet? They're like, no, you need to go across the road to the cyber cafe. And that wasn't just my flat. It was a common experience for the other students who I was there with. So, I mean, it's great, good for Spain at getting 70% fibre.
Fibre or bust.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
I suppose the second point I wanted to make was the socio-economic and social element of this. I mean, we touched on this earlier, but the idea of having gigabit speeds in the middle of nowhere, essentially means if you're born in and you live in the middle of nowhere and you are an entrepreneur who wants to start a business, there's no need for you or any of your colleagues or friends to move to a major city in order to do that. What this could lead to is regional economic boosts in places that we might not have actually anticipated.
Which would be great. Like I say, as somebody coming from the countryside, you see migration to the cities, and this would be brilliant. As ever, we welcome hearing from our listeners. We are podcast@itpro.co.uk. If you've got any experience in this field or any thoughts on the matter, do let us know. We love to hear from you.
We could talk about this for another hour, but sadly we're out of time. So Keumars, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your insight into the proposed broadband plans.
Not at all, and thanks for having me on.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn for up-to-date notifications, and subscribe to the IT Pro newsletter for a daily dose of IT insight in your inbox.
Don't forget to subscribe to the IT Pro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts.
We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.